welcome. I'm Frances Hayashida, the Director of the Latin American and Iberian Institute, or LAII, at the University of New Mexico. Our mission is to promote and support interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse through programming. I'd like to first acknowledge that the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. This evening's event, The Refugee Crisis in Latin America, Perspectives from UNHCR Offices on the Front Line, features Fernando Flores, head of the Lago Agrio field of the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. It will be moderated by Soledad Roybal. Soledad is a graduate student in the Latin American Studies program at UNM, and she previously served in the Obama administration at both the US Department of State and the US Department of Labor. Before I pass the Zoom mic to Soledad, I'd like to remind everyone to please mute your mics. We'll have time for questions at the end, and we encourage you to enter them into the chat, or you can unmute at the end and ask your question directly. So Soledad, thank you for moderating this evening.
Great, thank you so much, Frances. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm super excited to have Fernando Flores joining us from Ecuador. A little warning up front that he may have some internet issues, so please be patient as we get through those. But welcome, Fernando. It's really great for you to be here. So to give everyone a little bit of context, I have known Fernando for a very long time, since I was a freshman in college. And he was working for the UN Information Center in Washington, D.C. And later I would actually intern for him in the National Office of UNHCR in New York City. And he was a great boss who, even when he was traveling, would actually let me use his apartment occasionally so I wouldn't have to commute to New Jersey. That's how great he was. And as long as I've known Fernando, he's been active in the work of the United Nations. After UNHCR, from 2000 to 2014, Fernando worked at the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which many of you may know as ECLAC. And he worked there in the DC office as a research associate, primarily supporting the negotiations of the free trade area of the Americas. Looking for a huge change in his life, in 2014, he made the jump to the humanitarian sphere, joining the UN Refugee Agency. Fernando would work first as a program associate covering the Caribbean, and later he worked for the Regional Private Sector Partnerships Manager for the Americas. And in that capacity, he supported fundraising efforts in Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Mexico, and the United States as the liaison between the region and the PSP headquarters in Copenhagen. All of those incredible experiences helped set the foundation for what would come. And in September of 2017, Fernando set out on a series of international assignments and covering some of the most significant refugee crisis that we have been experiencing around the world. His first international assignment was in Dundo, is it Dundo? Angola. Dundo, where he was dealing with the Angola-Congolese border crisis. And Fernando was later part of the team, or he was part of that team setting up the refugee settlement for about 30,000 Congolese refugees. He would then be transferred to Tapachula, where he was supporting the agency's efforts in the Northern Triangle Caravan Crisis. And after about 6 months in Chiapas, Fernando then went to Cúcuta. I hope I'm saying that correctly, in Colombia. And he would work on the front lines dealing with the Venezuelan refugee crisis. So in each of these assignments, he's led respective program units, and which are basically the money people, which are very important. And he's been responsible for the execution of millions of dollars in humanitarian aid. And after 3 years, literally, I think it was about 3 or 4 days ago, Fernando has actually just arrived to Lago Agrio in Ecuador, and he serves, as Francis said, as the new head of office there. So, Fernando, thank you so much for taking the time. Your schedule is insane, and as you mentioned, you literally just moved countries. So, thank you so much for your willingness to join us and talk about the behind-the-scenes perspective on the UN refugee crisis. Can you just, I've read a whole lot and said a whole lot about you, but tell us more about your experiences and how you got into this line of work, and your personal and professional background. Why don't we start there, and where you grew up and all of that good stuff.
So let me just say again, thank you again to Soledad for the kind invitation, and to Francis for the introduction. It really is a pleasure to speak to the audience at UNM. Soledad didn't mention that one of the projects that I'm most proud of was at UNHCR. We were invited to undertake an outreach program with Hispanic serving institutions, and I became very I came to work very closely with HACU and all of its member organizations, and so it's a true honor to be able to speak with you all this evening. So a little about my journey. In many ways, lots of times you will ask people, well, how did you get involved in this? And they say, well, I just sort of fell into this. There was no falling into this. I was destined to work for the UN from the day one. My father was in the US Army, and we traveled around the world doing, with him and his activities and his assignments. And our last call of duty was in Virginia, Fairfax, Virginia. And I distinctly remember when, my parents took me to Robinson Secondary to register me, and they asked, the counselor there was asking, if there were any sports that you were interested in. No. Were there any, musical instruments where you want to be in the marching band? No. And, sort of ticking down the list, she started asking questions about, was I interested in politics? Was I interested in history, debate, this and yes? I said, yes, yes to all of those. And she said, we've got this organization, the Model UN Club, and I think that you would like it. And to be honest with you, that was the beginning of the end. I was hooked with Model UN. I was very lucky to be in a school that really supported Model UN and did all throughout high school. Then later on, did it in college, and even managed to make a job out of it as the National Model UN coordinator. That's all to say that I became enamored with the organization, the system, the UN system, and when I had the opportunity to actually work for it, first as an intern and then later as a staff member, it was an opportunity that I had, maybe a mission that I had to fulfill. So as far as working in the humanitarian field, that was not necessarily something that I set out to do. I was working fairly comfortably at ECLAC, or as some of you may know as CEPAL, Comisión Económica para América Latina, doing economic research and development, trade negotiations and that sort of thing. And but I wanted to go to the field. I wanted to go international. I wanted to go overseas. And an opportunity came up to join UNHCR, an organization that I had heard about and that I knew about its work, in terms of in the humanitarian sphere, but it wasn't necessarily an organization that I thought that I would see myself working in. And it was only because of, the encouragement of others and people that worked at UNHCR that I said, okay, you know what, I'll give this a chance. And about 7 years ago, I moved over to UNHCR, first working in the Washington office. And about 4 years ago, taking the leap and going to Angola. And really, as Soledad mentioned, I mean, the opportunities have been incredible ever since then. I have been in different contexts. I mean, when you're working in Africa, in the Congolese situation, from one day to the other, there were literally 30,000 Congolese refugees in Angola, and Angola was good enough. I don't know if that's the right adjective to use, but they were smart enough to call on UNHCR to come in and help. And we literally had to bring in tents and water purification systems and schools. And we had to call in all of our resources and all of our partners to set up a little city for 30,000 people. Juxtapose that to the current crisis. I'm now the head of office here in Lago, Agrio, Ecuador. We're about 10 miles from the Colombian border, in an international humanitarian crisis that is unlike pretty much anything out there. We're not like the Rohingya situation, where you don't have millions of people that you can see all in one place. This is, when I was in Cúcuta, Colombia, on the bridge, the Puente Internacional Simón Bolívar, we literally would stand there in the middle of the bridge, and there'd be 40,000 people would be crossing every day on one bridge. Here, because of COVID and whatnot, the bridge is closed, so people aren't able to cross in the former borders, but they're crossing through the trochas. These are the illegal crossings that are all along the border between Colombia and Ecuador, and also up between Colombia and Venezuela. And the difference is that you don't have one mass of people that are moving. You've got just people coming every day. And so UNHCR has had to set up a completely different framework for helping them. It's not like you set up a settlement. And this is your first lesson for today. We don't call them refugee camps, they're refugee settlements. We stopped calling them camps a couple of years ago, just because the notion of a camp really denigrates, what it is to have a place where you live. It's a settlement, because literally these are places where people live. And so in Ecuador or in Colombia, we don't have settlements. The closest thing that we would have is maybe a few tens of tents in a little city that would be a temporary housing. But we don't have anything near what you have in other parts of the world, where you have, some of your mega camps are 300 to 500,000 people that live there for years and years and years. So anyway, that's kind of a long answer to your question, Soli, in terms of, how I got to where I'm at. It's been a pretty crazy ride. It's been a pretty crazy ride from those days in New York City, helping people and teaching people about the UN, and to do model UN, to where I'm at today. So
it's been really exciting seeing all the transitions and seeing all the amazing work that you're doing, Fernando. And I'm really happy that you mentioned the difference in the settlements, because I remember when I first went to Palestine and I had an idea of what a refugee settlement was going to be, and then I visited and I was like, wait a minute, these people have been here for 50 years, and they're actual homes, and there's electricity and running water, and it's a very different experience than what I had anticipated. So I appreciate you talking about that.
absolutely.
Now, I know that each of the reasons why people are forced to become refugees is a little bit different. Can you talk to us a little bit about, and maybe also we'll start out. So first, talk to us a little bit about what has happened with the Congolese, and not too long, because there's so many different things. If we want to talk about the Congolese, and then the Central Americans, and then the Venezuelans. And I just want everyone to know that please submit the questions in the chat, or if you'd like to verbally ask your question, go ahead and drop me a note there, and we can make that happen. So, Fernando, let's start with the Congolese situation.
Sure. That actually is probably the only of the experiences that I've had with refugees, that's probably the nearest that you would call a textbook traditional refugee crisis. You basically had a political group. There was a governor in the state of Kasai, which is in the southern part of Congo, who was was on the other side of the political fence of the ruling president, and when the president, oh my gosh, I'm going to forget this. This is how tired I am. It was Kabila. He canceled elections, and this governor came out and spoke out against this. And the result was the army came in and basically started massacring people. The result of this was tens of thousands of individuals, Kasai, fleeing the region. Many of them went actually north towards the interior of Congo. Some of them went east towards the Great Lakes region, and many went south to Angola. Now, you have to keep in mind that the Kasai people actually are a transnational tribal group. In other words, that pretty much half of their land is in Congo and half of their land is in Angola. So this was always a very porous border to begin with. But when this situation occurred, the Angolan government actually closed the border, and the people that were left in Angola, the Congolese that had managed to cross over, were effectively, I don't want to say stuck, but they were there. They couldn't go back into Congo. So the Angola government very quickly made a humanitarian plea. They called out for international assistance. Organizations like UNHCR, but also World Food Program, UNICEF, World Health Organization, all set into action their emergency preparedness plans and went into action. The region where these refugees actually crossed over is a fairly remote area. It's about an hour's plane ride north of Luanda, but maybe it's a fortunate thing that the nearest town that they came to is Dundo, and Dundo actually is a town, because Dundo was the diamond capital, and it still is a diamond capital. There's lots of diamonds in that region. You ever watched the movie Blood Diamonds? Well, they come from the Congolese side of that region. Anyway, the point is that luckily there was an airstrip there, and so humanitarian agencies were able to come in, and the government set out. Okay, so just really quickly to say that about 5 years after the crisis, about half of the refugees have already returned back to Congo after the elections. And so we really, that is the best case scenario. That is a situation in which refugees are actually able to go home. So that is your traditional, and my personal experience in dealing with the refugee crisis when there's literally a civil war or massacre that takes place.
Okay, so tell us now a little bit about working in Mexico and Tapachula. And if you can, I don't know how much experience you had or any information you have about what's happening currently on the border. Anything, information or thoughts you have on that would be greatly appreciated.
Sure, absolutely. So when I was in Tapachula, we were at the height of the caravan crisis. And so where we had the individuals who were leaving the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, traveling up through Central America. Now, it's important to note that it wasn't just those individuals that were coming up north. There's a huge amount of traffic of what we call transcontinentals, people that are coming literally from Africa, from the Middle East, from Asia. They're actually walking their way across Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, all the way through the Darien Peninsula, all the way up. So the main situation that we were dealing with was that the United States had closed its border, or at least had really put into place some very onerous restrictions in regards to individuals being able to cross and to seek asylum in the United States. And so what we had was a huge backlog of individuals that were staying in Mexico. So the Mexican government, called upon UNHCR to help out in the process of dealing with asylum claims and whatnot. And the difference here is that, there weren't any camps. We weren't called upon to set up any kind of, permanent living situations. What we then were doing, we're really setting up mechanisms by which individuals that were seeking refugee status in the United States or even in Mexico could actually be locally integrated. And so local integration, looks to work with private enterprise and also to work with the public sector to find, decent living, decent work for individuals. And so it's a completely different context. It's a completely different.
We lost you for about 20 seconds.
Oh, okay. So the big issue is that the Biden administration has changed its policy vis-a-vis refugee status and asylum seekers in Mexico and staying in Mexico. And so actually UNHCR is now working with the Mexican government and the US government to accelerate the process of facilitating asylum claims for Central Americans primarily to come to the United States. And so this is actually great news. Even here in Ecuador, the US government has already told us how many people they're going to be able to resettle. And so we're now working with our local partners to see who are the priority people to get them resettled in the United States and in other countries.
So Fernando, you had said that the US government has already indicated how many people they're willing to place. Do you know what that process is actually going to look like and how it might differ for children versus families, and sort of what goes into ensuring that particularly the children are safe?
Sure. So the resettlement process for UNHCR is not new. It's not something that was just created, yesterday. We've been doing resettlement since the very creation of the organization. And we have one of the most thorough processes of background checks, of investigations, of really making sure that the people that are most in need, the highest priority individuals are allowed, invited and are allowed to be resettled. And it's not just the United States. We also are very fortunate to count on other countries, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, just to name a few. And actually, we've had some countries that are relatively new onto the resettlement stage. Brazil, for instance, or Argentina, they're taking refugees as well. So the question of unaccompanied minors is actually one that's obviously one that's very sensitive. It's one that one needs to be very careful with. And I would like to say that we actually resettle very, very, very few unaccompanied minors. We work very closely with the International Red Cross, and we have an entire system and network set up in which we really do look to reconnect children or unaccompanied minors with their family members. And so actually resettlement of unaccompanied minors is something that it's rare if it ever does actually happen. And in most cases, if an unaccompanied minor, if every option is exhausted, even in a situation, let's say here in Ecuador, we would then really place that child with social services in the country, in this case, let's say Ecuador or Colombia, wherever the child has arrived. If it's a case of an unaccompanied minor outside of their country of origin.
That's really interesting to hear about. What about the refugee camps that are on the Mexican side of the border that were created during the Trump administration? What is happening with those? And did UNHCR were they doing any work with those settlements? Well, I don't know if those should actually be called camps because they were sort of makeshift spaces.
Right. So they were not UNHCR settlements. In that sense, these were makeshift, dwellings and whatnot that people just found themselves, in the northern border. And so what we would do in a lot of those instances is we operate on a we operate on something that's called the AGD principle, and it's dealing with people on priority of their age, gender, and diversity. And diversity can be religious, it can be sexual orientation. Diversity covers a big chunk, but it's age, gender, and diversity. And so, so we would, in those kinds of locations, communities, we will work with them to make sure that people know their rights, because at the end of the day, fundamentally, that is what we're most looking to achieve, is to make sure that individuals are aware of the rights that they have, either in the country in which they've arrived or in their country of origin. And so it really is making sure that people exhaust the full set of laws and protections that they have. Fortunately, we're very lucky that most of the countries of the Americas have all signed on to the Cartagena Agreement. The Cartagena Agreement really set out a broad framework in which countries agree to give certain protections to refugees. And we're very, very careful in this notion of what a refugee is. And maybe this is something that we should have said from the very beginning, is that for us, a refugee is any person that is facing any kind of, sense of persecution based on, it can be their age, their gender, it can be political views, religious views, sexual orientation. And now we actually have our first environmental refugees also. These are individuals that fear for their life because of environmental challenges. And so we're very fortunate that most of the countries of the Americas have signed on to the Cartagena Agreement, which really sets out a series of obligations that countries have vis-a-vis refugees. And so, so in those areas, the work that we would do, and now what we're doing is working with those communities to make sure that they are aware of the changes that have occurred in the United States. And for the first time, UNHCR actually now has offices on the southern US border. We previously only had an office in Washington, DC. We now have, I believe that there's an office in San Diego, and then I believe there's an office in McAllen, Texas. Anyway, but the point is that we're making sure the communities really are aware of the changes that have taken place in US law, and so that they're given proper access to the asylum process.
Okay, I will read the question from Rebecca. She's asking, could you talk more about what is involved in helping Central Americans who are seeking asylum in Mexico and the US become locally integrated?
Sure, absolutely. So in Mexico, one of the projects that we were working on that really was transformative was, every country, no matter what their level of development, always has jobs that people don't want to do. It's just the reality of life. And here in the States, there's this age-old argument of, well, do illegal immigrants take away jobs from Americans? Well, I mean, there's just certain jobs that it's pretty difficult to get Americans to do. And the same happens in Mexico, or even in Colombia, for instance. You would think that there would be enough people to do every job, and that's not the case. And so very specifically in Mexico, we were working with manufacturing companies in pretty much the central corridor in Mexico. And what we were doing was actually facilitating job matching. And so the companies we had a local partner that would work on this project. And so the local partner would find companies or work with companies in developing a profile. The company would then. Okay, so what I was just trying to say is there's been a sea change in the way we help refugees. It's no longer about putting them in settlements. That's the last thing that we want to do. What we want to do is that people have jobs, and so they can have a sense of self-identity and take control of their lives. So just really quickly, in the case of Mexico, what we were doing is we were connecting companies that needed manufacturing workers, and then the companies would promise to give them a job for a period of time, promise to give them a house, obviously a salary for their work, and then what we would do is we would match them with the individuals and help them get to the city where they would work. So really is the key change now is that, you know, we're not looking just to give a handout to people. We're actually looking to make their lives, you know, sustainable for the long term.
That's great, Fernando. It's really interesting to know and reassuring to know that they are helped so much. We have several questions that are related to Venezuela. And so I thought before we go in and talk about Venezuela, let's have some people ask the questions. And so there's actually, I think, 3 people. And so we'll have them each ask the questions, and then you can speak about Venezuela. And so the first question is from Andres Belisario. Andres, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? And maybe you can pull up your camera too if you feel like it. Okay, I'm happy to ask Andres's question and read it out. He says, "Greetings, Fernando. It's an honor to have you here with us today. I would like to ask you a question. What's the main assistance that the UN offers to thousands of Venezuelan refugees moving around South America? I mean, besides the tents you talked about earlier." So that is one question. The next question related to Venezuela is from Lauren Rust Valdez. I don't know, Lauren, if you feel like asking, you had put a couple questions in here.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm sorry, I can't turn on my video. I get internet problems, but thank you so much for being here, Dr. Flores. And I was going to ask about the recent temporary status granted to Venezuelans in Colombia. I think that happened in February. And how has that changed the influx of Venezuelans coming into Colombia? Or has that helped or changed the border crisis there? And then in that particular situation, is there anything we could apply here in the US? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a third question, Maria Zambrano. Maria, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Fernando, for your presentation. My question is related to what is the difference about the humanitarian aid to Venezuelan people inside and outside this country? Because I followed the different world from social media about ACNUR's job, and there's different assistance on helping people with some medicines, identity issues, and so on. Can you explain what is the difference being in Cúcuta, Colombia, and inside, for example, Caracas? Thank you.
Okay, I know that was 3 very long questions, so I hope that if something doesn't get answered, we can definitely loop back to that.
So the first question, you know, what is the main kind of aid that is given to refugees? To be honest with you, the single greatest piece of aid that we can give people is information. And so we probably spend, I mean, if you ask me, you know, what's my budget for what we call CBI, which is cash-based interventions, yes, it's greater. because that's literally money that we give to individuals so that they can subsist. But if you ask me what activity do we do that reaches the most people, it's information giving. Because it's connecting people with the resources that are already being given out in the countries. And so this sort of feeds on to the last question that Maria had in terms of, what is the different kinds of aid that is being given in different countries. It depends on the country. Most of the countries of the region are actually giving some kind of monetary assistance to refugees. Some give more than others, but depending on the country, they do have different kinds of rights. In some countries, refugees are allowed to work from day one. In other countries, it takes a little longer. So it really does depend on the country. The second question in regards to the temporary status that Colombia granted, yes, this was a sea changer. I was still in Colombia when this was announced by President Duque. This is really unheard of. I mean, it's temporary protected status, and it's not really temporary, it's 10 years. I mean, 10 years is nuts. I mean, even the United States, if you're lucky, they do TPS on 18 months, 24 months, but I mean, 10 years, this is going to allow Venezuelans in Colombia to work, to have an identity, to really come out of the shadows and really work in the formal economy. And that just changes everything. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that refugees have is, most of the time they're relegated to the informal economy. And so they don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to education. And this is going to change all of that. Are there challenges with it? Yes, there are. How is this going to be implemented? It's a mess. They're still working out the kinks. They're still working out to see exactly who's going to qualify. There are some very specific parameters in terms of when the person was in Colombia that will determine their eligibility. But those people that do and are granted the temporary status will have a substantial change in their lives. I think that answered most of the questions. I mean, as far as what kind of assistance is given, it can be anything. In some countries, we do pay for
Really happy to hear that in Ecuador, healthcare is
You know what?
refugees. So one of the things that you and I have had some interesting conversations about are the lives of women in refugee camps. And a lot of the challenges that women in the world have to deal with that are very unique to the female experience. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, the sad reality of the refugee crisis anywhere in the world is really boils down to the issue of survivors of gender-based violence. And so we do an inordinate amount of work with survivors of gender-based violence, and we do a lot to try to prevent it. And it can be simple things, like, for instance, in Dundo, in the refugee settlement, one of the first things that we did was we sent out a call to get night lamps installed, because darkness is the worst enemy, because it's in the darkest corners that the worst atrocities happen. And so we were able to make a call out, and we were able to get a donor to give, I think it was something like 300 solar-powered lamp posts, so that the settlement would have night. And so that's just one example. We of a whole series of activities. We do a lot of head of household empowerment, a lot of single mothers that have been separated from their husbands or their spouses or their partners, are taking care of small children. And so in order for them to be able to work and have a decent income, we need to take care of their kids. And so we do any and everything that we can to really empower women to be able to be self-sufficient and to take care of their families, because most of the time it's not just about them, it's about the family that has accompanied them. A lot of the work that we do is really trying to prevent things like survival sex. I mean, that is just an unfortunate reality of the situation. Is this horrid thought of someone that would have to give their body in order to get a meal. And so we really do everything in our power. And I mean, I hate to put it this way, but in our category of priorities, the lowest priority is the single male, because unfortunately, their situation doesn't compare to what a woman or a mother has to face. And so we do incredible efforts. I mean, things as small as putting lamp posts up to really giving high priority to resettlement cases for women with children. We're big proponents. UNHCR made a decision a number of years ago to be a huge proponent of breastfeeding. And so if you're a mother, a new mother, you've got a newborn with you, we're going to do everything in our power to connect you with organizations that support breastfeeding. Not only is it cheaper, but it's healthier for the child. And so we really look to support all of those issues, and anything that we can do to work with our health partners in dealing with sexual and reproductive health is something that's very important for the refugee community.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, they don't have access to, and so consequently, it just creates a cycle. And so we work really closely with them to make sure that everyone gets the care that they need.
Thank you, Fernando. I know when I was at the State Department and we had meetings with UNHCR to talk about creating places where women could charge their phones that were women only, because there were many women who were forced to, survival sex to get their phones charged, which is horrible.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So, I would love to hear anything else that you think is important for us to know about the situation with Venezuela or with Mexico, in terms of what we should know that we don't know and what we can be doing to help the situation of the refugees.
I mean, that's a huge question, Sully, and I think probably the only thing that I can really say is, and I was just talking with someone the other day, and they were saying, oh, we just wish that that Maduro would disappear, that Maduro would disappear, and that then everyone would be happy and people will go back to Venezuela and life will be great again. And the unfortunate reality is that even if Maduro disappears tomorrow, the sad truth is that Venezuela, it'll take years, if not generations, to come out of the humanitarian crisis that it has endured. And so I guess the only thing that I would really tell people is, don't forget about these places, even when the war stops, even when the dictator leaves, even when you think that it's all taken care of. There are people that are still going to be in need. And the other thing that I would tell people, and this really has, it deals with not only Venezuela and Central America and all of these protracted refugee crises, is that your help matters. You can do your part. There are any host of activities that young people can do to raise awareness about the refugee crisis, and you can take your pick. It can be, people in Sudan, or it can be the Rohingya, or it can be Venezuelans. There is so much that needs to be done, and there's so many partners that are out there. They're religious organizations, they're nonprofit organizations, they're humanitarian organizations that are doing their part in each one of these situations, and they can use your help. So I would just say, educate yourself, learn more about these crises, find out, who are the main actors, who are the ones that are helping the situations, and try to do your part, because there really is a role for everyone. And if anyone is interested in working for UNHCR, I would definitely encourage it. What are we looking for? We're looking for everyone, because we literally have anyone and everyone in our organizations. We even sometimes hire veterinarians. Why? Because in a lot of these settlements, the one thing that people like to have is pets, because it's the one thing that doesn't bitch at you at the end of the day. Okay. So one of the problems that we have is sometimes we get overloaded with dogs and cats and whatnot. And so we've had to hire veterinarians to go in to spay and neuter animals. And so there is any opportunity that's out there. If you're a geographer, we need people to help us do settlement maps. If you're a doctor, there's a place for you to work with us. So really, we hire anyone and everyone. Go to unhcr.org, international careers. You can find all the information there. I highly encourage you to consider it. It really is, it's an incredible job, and there's lots of work to be done.
So piggybacking on that, Javier Estorga, I don't know if you are up to asking your question live. Javier, I'm happy to read it for you. It'd be great if you get on camera.
Hi, thank you, Fernando and Soledad. Well, my question is, and try to find out what is a regular day work in your life. I need to see what are the activities you perform, and if somebody, I will be interested. By the way, I completed my master's in Latin American studies with focus in anthropology and human rights. But what is that? What is your work in the everyday? So that's it.
So what I was trying to say was that we're the ultimate job aggregator. And so what we're doing is that when we arrive into a country, we have specialists in different fields. So let's say if you're someone that has worked in human rights, you're probably going to be a protection officer or a protection associate. What is that person going to do? That person is going to work with local or international NGOs to do the outreach and do the programs that we feel are needed in that country. So you're probably going to be drawing up a work program for an outreach activity that is going to do a multimedia campaign on getting the latest protection procedures in Colombia out to people of concern. That's what we call refugees, as people of concern, persons of concern. And so that would be an activity. Or for instance, if you're a program person, program are the money people. We're the ones that make sure that people have the money that they need to do the activities that they're doing. What are we doing? We're negotiating contracts with organizations to be able to do livelihood projects. And so today, for instance, I was meeting with an organization that works with women in Ecuador, with Venezuelan refugees in Ecuador, and helping them do manualidades, handicrafts. Or if you are someone in the health field, you're going to be working with our partners, maybe in a settlement, setting up a new health clinic. I mean, what we do is we usually come in with a core team. So for instance, in Ecuador, we're about 200 staff members, but the total number of people that are working for UNHCR could range in a couple thousands. And these are going to be local NGO or international NGO, or even government employees. And so, I mean, yes, my job is mostly behind a desk. That's usually where I'm going to be, where you're going to find me. But I've got, friends and colleagues that are out in the field every day. They're on the border, watching and seeing who's crossing, asking them questions, finding out where they're going, where they've come from. It's pretty diverse. You can be doing a little bit of everything.
That's great. Thank you, Fernando. We have a question from Lois Meyer, and her question is, what is it like to do refugee work, or what was it like to do refugee work during the Trump years? And how do you feel things have changed now under the Biden administration?
Look, I mean, it's actually rather interesting because, truth be told, UNHCR actually continued to do pretty much its work as it was. The single decision that the Trump administration took that really sort of was different for us was the decision to reduce the number of resettlement cases. That really affected, the work that we did. We had lots of talks with the Trump administration, and they were very persistent on that. And so that changed overnight. The Biden administration has completely opened up and has said that they're going to take in the new refugees. They've set new limits, new ceilings. I believe it's at 125,000 in the first fiscal year. And so that changes dramatically, the landscape in regards to the resettlement scape. But a lot of the other work that we were doing, we continue to do, and the Trump administration actually was one of our single largest donors, and they were very supportive of refugee settlement operations in other parts of the world. The one area in which they did change was in the issue of resettlement, and that was something that was a challenge. But you know what? In many ways, it forced us to really change the way we did business, and we really heightened our efforts at local integration. Finding places for people outside of the United States, and that was, I think, a positive outcome, is that we got new countries to take refugees, and so there's a silver lining everywhere. Maybe that's a good political answer to the question, but in the long term, we are excited to see the changes with the Biden administration in regards to the resettlement. It's a welcomed change.
Great. Joe Ruvido, would you like to ask your question? Or I'm happy to read it, but it'd be great if you wanted to turn on your camera or your mic and ask it.
Hi, thanks. I think, Fernando, you already answered it. I didn't realize it had been previously asked about the Duque decision in Colombia, but thank you very much for the presentation.
Happy to.
Yeah.
No, we're really excited. I mean, it really is it was a total surprise to us. And as I said before, I mean, there's still some kinks that need to be worked out, but we're really excited to see this, and we're excited to see that other countries are looking to follow, and so hopefully some other countries will make decisions that are going to be a little more forward thinking because of what President Duque did.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again. I can't help but think that there's something behind it, since it is Duque y Uribe, but I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. So thank you.
So one of the things that Joe posted in the written was the idea of strings attached to this. Are there any strings attached that you can that you've noticed?
The biggest issue really has to do with the parameters. I mean, there's still going to be a lot of Venezuelans that are not going to qualify. And so this is an issue that we are working with the Colombian government to really try to maximize the number of Venezuelans that qualify for the program. I mean, when it first came out, there was a lot of speculation in regards to some of the things. I mean, but as what usually happens, there were a lot of rumors before the actual law was produced. And we're very fortunate to see that most of the things that we thought might happen didn't happen. Like, for instance, there was a rumor that people that already had asylum claims, that they weren't going to be able to claim the temporary protected status, and that actually is not the case. They are going to be allowed to claim the status. So actually, I mean, I'm not, it's not I mean, there's nothing perfect out there. I mean, but by and large, it's a fairly strong and very robust offer. The biggest issue that we're going to face is just making sure that the maximum number of people qualify. There are some very strict rules in regards to being able to prove that you were in Colombia during a certain period of time. And the biggest problem that Venezuelans have is documentation. That is the single greatest tragedy, is that you have a whole generation, thousands upon thousands of Venezuelans that don't have access to birth certificates, don't have access to passports, don't have access to normal immigration documentation. And so it just affects everything else. It just makes their life miserable everywhere else because they don't have the ability to prove their personhood.
Thank you, Fernando. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. We'll be closing up soon, but I want to call on Jacna Paula to ask her question. Jacna? She says, good evening. What measures have you taken to help support Venezuelan refugees in Colombia during the COVID-19 pandemic, considering both countries can't control the pandemic and the medical situation everyone is facing is a hard crisis?
No, that's a very good question. Thank you so much for asking. We literally had to turn on a dime because we did have this situation really, just fall upon us. And so we did implement a series of health supports. We literally helped some of the local governments create ICU wards and isolation areas. And so we did, because we weren't able to do other projects, what we did was we took that money and we turned it into COVID relief funds. And so we're not a health provider in any stretch of the imagination, but we were able to do certain things. Like we have something called the RHU, which is the Refugee Housing Unit. So I encourage everyone to Google that when you're done. Google UNHCR RHU, Refugee Housing Unit. This is a temporary structure that was actually built, that was designed by IKEA. And it has replaced tents. We don't actually use tents anymore, very few at least. We now use these RHUs. And so what our crack team of shelter experts did was they were able to take these RHUs and create a whole isolation ward and ICU wards across around the world, really, and out of these RHUs. And so if you want to look up something really interesting, go on YouTube and look for UNHCR RHU Cúcuta, CUCUTA, and you'll see a video there, and I can share it with Soli later, maybe Soli, you can post this, but there's an incredible video that shows how they took these RHUs, which were meant to be refugee housing, turned them into medical wards. And so we've done a lot of that, and we've had to redirection a lot of our aid to making sure that that refugees would have access to COVID relief. We are calling on governments, though, to vaccinate refugees in their countries. We are not paying for vaccinations. We feel very strongly about that. Countries need to live up to their end of the stick and their end of the bargain. And we're happy to see that most countries are including refugees in their vaccination plans. And that's the best that we can hope for at this stage.
Great. Thank you so much, Fernando. I wish we had more time because I want to know about what life is like for children in the refugee camps, how you deal with schooling, and what life is like for the average, UNHCR worker. In time, we can get into all of that. But is there anything leave us with before we end this?
No, I would just say is that knowledge education is key. Learn about these circumstances, learn about these crises, learn about these situations. the more people know about, refugee issues, and really understand that anyone can become a refugee in a moment's notice. Anyone. When you are in the middle of the Angolan highlands and you go by a person's, refugee unit, and you see that they've made all these changes and this, that, and the other, and you get to talk to them and you find out that that person was an engineer, and that person was living in their town and had a career, had a life, and that they're now having to subsist in this, couple tens of square feet space, and they had to give up their home and they had to give up their career and everything, and they really don't see any future for themselves, then you really understand just how fragile everything that we have truly is. And it really does make you appreciate more, what you have around you. I will just end by saying that UNHCR, because of the good fortune of many years in the Americas of not having too many refugee crises, we actually are very much interested in Spanish-speaking individuals. It's very difficult for us to find professionals and to get professionals that speak English and Spanish well. And so if anyone that's watching or listening, is interested in a career in the humanitarian space, I would not only encourage you to check out UNHCR, but also check out some of our partners that we work with: Doctors Without Borders, Doctors of the World, CARE, Save the Children. There's so many organizations out there that deal with refugee issues. We desperately are in need of Spanish speakers, and so and Portuguese speakers, by the way, as well. We unfortunately are facing a series of crises in Portuguese-speaking countries, and so if you speak English and Portuguese, you will greatly increase your odds of getting a job. So I would just really encourage anyone that's interested to learn more about UNHCR and the work that we do, and definitely would be more than happy to come again and talk about how getting a job in the UN at a later time.
That's great. Thank you, Fernando. And I imagine there's a lot of people here who speak Spanish or Portuguese or another indigenous language, since that is a requirement of many of our programs. Anyway, thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you and to be able to spend some time with you. I will now pass it to Dr. Hayashida to close up.
I also just want to express my thanks and thank you to all the audience. I don't know, with the Zoom goodbye and a show of appreciation, for Fernando. So please join me in thanking him for giving us time. He, just moved there, just very busy schedule, and we're extremely grateful. This was very, important information for all of us to have. Thank you, Fernando, and I hope we get to see you again.
My pleasure. Happy to. Anytime. And sorry about the internet connectivity issues.
Don't worry about it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you,
Good
everyone.
enough.